Hello, thanks for joining me today. This is the How Inclusive is My Early Childhood Classroom webinar. My name is Monica Lesperance, and I'm with the DC Special Education Cooperative and the program director for our Include DC program. This webinar is part of a series on early childhood inclusion that was developed by the DC Special Education Cooperative. The co-op is a small nonprofit charter support organization here in DC. The charter schools can elect to become members of the co-op so that they can access all of our support services and resources. At the co-op, our vision is that all students with disabilities have access to a high-quality education, and we work with charter schools to make that vision a reality. We do this in many ways, including through PD and training on-site, in person, and through webinar like this one. We also do this through resource sharing and technical assistance on special education policy and practice, and by facilitating collaboration with OSSI, the Public Charter School Board, and other city agencies. One of the co-op's many projects is Include DC. Include is a course we designed for general ed teachers to prepare them to work in inclusive classrooms. Include can be taken for credit through Trinity University. Last year, we launched an early childhood-focused cohort of the course through a partnership with Fight for Children. We just finished our second cohort and are planning to run at least 2 more in school year 16-17. And we've just released the application for our fall cohort, which I will share a link for at the end of the webinar. So this webinar is part of a is the first of a four webinar series that we're hosting this year to bring some of our Include DC course content to the broader charter community, because we know not everyone can commit the time to a 14-week course. So in this first webinar of the series, we're going to address these guiding questions. What is inclusion? Why is it important in early childhood years? What are effective practices? And then, is your classroom ready? Inclusion is a term those of us in education use all the time without thinking much about it. And over the years that we've worked in schools, we've found that the word inclusion means different things to different people. Before you can even start to think about the quality of your inclusion program or inclusion classroom, you need to have an agreed upon definition of that concept and what it really means. So this is how we at the co-op look at inclusion. We're going to start by looking at what inclusion is not. Inclusion is not defined by IDEA, the special education law. The term inclusion doesn't appear in the federal law. Though the concept of LRE, or least restrictive environment, is a really big part of the law, but LRE is not the same thing as inclusion. All schools must provide a continuum of placements for students with disabilities based on need, with the least restrictive placement on that continuum being the general education classroom. So, though it's not defined in the law, it is addressed in the law. Inclusion isn't simply defined by the physical space that the student receives instruction in. If you have a student who leaves the general education classroom once in a while for a related service, you can still have an inclusive classroom. On the contrary, you may also have a student who spends his whole day in the general ed classroom, but it doesn't mean that he's included. He could just be sitting in the room completely disengaged from the class. And then finally, inclusion is not always best for every student. Some students do need more restrictive settings to be successful. So then what is it? Inclusion is a mindset and approach. An inclusive classroom is built on the belief that all students have the right to be in that classroom and that the adults and the environment should adapt to meet the students' needs. Inclusion is also proven to benefit both students with and without disabilities. Studies have shown that in early childhood in particular, students without disabilities in inclusive classrooms do as well or better than those in non-inclusive classrooms. And the same goes for most students with disabilities. And then most importantly, inclusion is something that takes time and effort. Mindset alone isn't going to create a high-quality classroom. So administrators and teachers need to put in some work. When an individual classroom is inclusive, all teachers in that room have shared responsibility for all students. This means that in a co-taught classroom, the general and special educator are equals and are teachers of all children. It's not a shared classroom space, but it's shared teaching. The curriculum and the structure of the classroom are designed with the goal of being accessible to all. This means that activities are not always adapted after the fact to be accessible to all students, but that those adaptations are built in from the very early planning stages. And third, in an inclusive classroom, students with disabilities are not just present in the room getting the exact same instruction as peers, but are receiving individualized support to meet goals that are aligned with the general ed classroom content and activities. And while this last one seems obvious, students with and without disabilities are educated together, this is where the concept of inclusion is more nuanced. In an inclusive classroom, you won't see all the children with disabilities over on one side of the room with a special ed teacher. The children with disabilities are participating in meaningful ways right alongside their non-disabled peers. And again, inclusion isn't just about location or setting, it is about the approach and the mindset. Early childhood inclusion is a really hot topic right now. Just in the past few years, there has been a growing body of research to show that early childhood inclusion is good for young children, both with and without disabilities. So going back just a few years is a little timeline of where we are. In 2009, the Council for Exceptional Children, their division of early childhood, and the National Association for the Education of Young Children released a research summary and position statement in favor of early childhood inclusion. In the years between 2009 and 2014, significant research studies came out with a lot of summaries to show that outcomes for children with disabilities in inclusive settings are positive. And then just recently, in September 2015, the U.S. Department of Education released a policy statement in support of early childhood inclusion. So this is certainly something that is gaining momentum as we see more research and more agencies coming out in favor of creating more inclusive early childhood classrooms. In all of those position statements and research findings that I just mentioned, they all are encouraging early childhood inclusion, but they also acknowledge that there are significant barriers and challenges. In our work with general ed teachers, we sometimes find that there are belief barriers to inclusion that we have to break down in order for teachers to really understand and embrace their role in the classroom. If we're asking teachers to do more, we need to make sure they are bought in and that they are prepared and supported. So one of the first barriers that we encounter is believing that the child, and in some cases the parent, is not the problem. Sometimes we need to help others see the child through a different lens. The child isn't trying to be difficult. The child isn't trying to disrupt the class. They just have different needs that aren't being met. It's not about blame. It's about finding out what's going on and finding a solution. Related to that is the role of the environment. As teachers, we can get very territorial about our classrooms. But to create an inclusive classroom, we have to be willing to make changes to the classroom setup, the structure, and to our instructional practices. Human behavior is shaped by our environment. The last two here are kind of the same concept. Adaptations made for one child will benefit many. This isn't cheating. The idea of cheating isn't such a big deal in early childhood when children are all at such different developmental levels. Though sometimes we have to work to accept that some children just need more or different support than others. And finally, at any age level, early childhood all the way up through high school, the teaching staff need to embrace the idea that fair does not mean equal. So now that we've defined inclusion and touched on why it's so important, we can move on to talk a little bit about effective practices. Our Include DC curriculum incorporates several evidence-based practices for inclusive classrooms. The curriculum is also closely aligned with the quality indicators in the Inclusive Classroom Profile Observation and Rating tool that you see a picture of there on your screen, also called the ICP. The author of the ICP, Elena Sokoku, designed the tool so observers could use it to rate the quality of a classroom's inclusive practices based on 13 indicators. And our key areas of inclusive practices are based around those key indicators. So we have 7 key areas of inclusive practice: classroom climate and community, adaptations of space and materials, routines and transitions, adult guidance and scaffolding, conflict resolution and PBIS, feedback and relationships, and collaboration and communication. So I'm going to walk you through those key areas. The first is classroom climate and community. Community and climate matter because students need to feel safe and welcome in their environment in order to be ready to learn. The same way that we as adults need to feel safe and comfortable in an environment to let our guard down and be open to learning. So how do you do that? In an inclusive classroom climate, it starts with teachers who create a sense of belonging and membership to the group. Most schools will have lots of books and toys and other images that show diverse cultures, races, and ethnicities. Very few classrooms have pictures and toys that have representations of people with different abilities. Group membership is a critical part of an inclusive classroom. All students should have their work represented in the classroom to show that they're valued. Group membership is also supported by making sure there are opportunities for responsibility for all students, including students with disabilities, like classroom jobs, and then opportunities for all students to share in class decision-making and choice-making. For each of the key areas of practice we're including on the slide, some questions teachers can ask as they look at their classroom to see where they might make changes. So in the case of climate and community, teachers can be looking for representations of diversity. Some examples might be dollhouse figures using wheelchairs or books with characters that have hearing aids, for example. Teachers can also make sure that they are displaying the work of all children without assigning value. So that means if all the students in the class draw a picture of a house, posting everybody's work, not just the 3 best examples of a house. And then, of course, making sure that students with disabilities have access to and can perform class jobs. So finding ways to make classroom jobs accessible for all students. Our second key area of practice are adaptations of space and materials. And this is important. Teachers adapt space and materials for students with disabilities. They're allowing for accessibility and independence, which are going to create the greatest opportunity for learning. Young children learn through their senses, and they need to be able to manipulate materials in the classroom and move freely throughout the classroom. And some ways this can be done are by making sure that the classroom environment is accessible so students can access materials independently, and so that those students with physical disabilities can get around easily and without adult help. Using picture cues and other visuals that represent centers and materials will also allow students to find and use materials independently. And then, of course, the use of specialized furniture for seating, positioning devices, ramps, and even special bikes or other adapted toys as needed for the students in the classroom. This can be as simple as putting paper clips on the pages in a book in your library center so that the child can turn the pages independently if they have fine motor challenges, or giving a student a special adapted fork or spoon to help them with feeding themselves during lunch or snack. So the general ed teacher can ask yourself, can all my children get around the room without help? Can all my students find and use materials? And do I have any areas that my students with disabilities cannot access that other students who are typically developing can? And these are things that the general ed teacher is not coming up with alone, but are planned in partnership with the special ed teachers and the rest of the IEP team. Teachers can ask themselves these questions to see where they need assistance to make adjustments. But the expectation is not that as a general ed teacher you are doing all of these things on your own. Our third key practice is routines and transitions. This comes back to the need for a safe and predictable environment for young children. Both typically and atypically developing young children need those routines and smooth transitions to feel safe and secure. And this is going to set the stage for exploration and academic risk-taking. Most of what makes good routines and transitions isn't specific to inclusion or to students with disabilities. It's just good teaching. For our purposes, we focus on teachers having cues and a clear process for transitions between activities that will appeal to different senses. So things like using music, chants, hand signals, etc. during various transitions. Another basic strategy that's critical in an inclusive early childhood classroom is a visual schedule, one that can be used for the whole class or one that is adapted for an individual student who may need more support. In an inclusive classroom, all of these transitions and regular classroom routines are flexible and adapted for children with disabilities, as well as supportive of child development. And the third question on the side there for teachers to ask gets at some of those belief barriers that I mentioned earlier. Teachers really need to be willing to make changes for students who need them, but even more importantly, teachers need to have permission and they need to have support from administrators to make those changes. Our fourth key practice is adult guidance and scaffolding. Of course, all good teachers are doing this constantly because it's teaching. But when it comes to young children with disabilities, appropriate scaffolding is even more important. Students can't access the curriculum without well-planned adaptations and guidance. And while this is obvious during most structured activities, it's also critical during less structured free play in the classroom and on the playground. And some of the ways that teachers do this is by asking questions, providing suggestions, modeling, cueing, prompting, all those great tools, and using special assistive devices and tools in the classroom. Adult guidance should also include encouraging and supporting peer interactions. This can be through facilitating collaborative play, helping scaffold communication among peers, and also orchestrating peer support and peer modeling. All of this should be happening in small and whole group times, both structured and unstructured. This is where the adults in the room are making inclusion happen. Well-planned adult guidance is what makes it work. By guiding students with disabilities in their play, in their communication, and in their peer interaction, teachers can ensure that those students are having meaningful access to the curriculum and not just exposure. It's more than them being in the room. This is how they really have meaningful engagement with the classroom activities. Our fifth key practice, conflict resolution and PBIS, or positive behavior interventions and supports, are also not unique to special education or inclusion. They're a part of our key practices because they have significant impact on how a child with a disability interacts in the classroom. We know that the ways that children are taught to resolve conflict in early childhood will influence their success in later years, and children with disabilities may need even more support than their typically developing peers to resolve classroom conflict. Additionally, students with disabilities often demonstrate those behaviors that can be very challenging for teachers. So what makes this an inclusion strategy? Classrooms that are using PBIS and helping students to solve conflicts and regulate emotions in a positive and productive way are going to be more successful at inclusion than those that are using punitive or one-size-fits-all methods of classroom management. So for example, classrooms that are using a color system, students are placed on red when they misbehave, they're on green when they're doing well. A system like that that's applied class-wide may not have the best outcomes for some students with disabilities. For a student with a developmental delay in emotional development or communication, that color system might have the opposite effect and actually create more behaviors that the teacher doesn't want to see. So classrooms that are willing to implement an individualized behavior support system are more inclusive by design. And some of the questions for teachers to ask are focused on general classroom behavior practices. How do I resolve conflict between students? Am I using negative feedback? Does my classroom behavior system work for everyone? And do I provide language support for students with disabilities when resolving conflicts with peers? We could definitely do an entire session on this practice alone, but I think you get the idea. Number 6 is feedback and relationships. This is important because research shows that caring adults are key to students' emotional well-being. We also know that the ways that teachers provide feedback to children influences their learning and how they look at themselves. So when we look at inclusive early childhood classrooms, we are looking for teachers to have many warm, positive interactions with all of their students. This means that teachers talk to children in ways that show they care about the child. They're giving high fives, thumbs up, saying good job, asking personal questions like, did you have fun with mommy this weekend? These kind of interactions are indicative of positive relationships between children and adults. We're also looking for teachers to give process-oriented feedback to students. And while those good jobs and high fives and thumbs up are all important, children also need feedback that is specific and frames the child's efforts or thought processes, which will lead to greater learning. So there's just positive feedback, you did a good job, and then there's process-oriented feedback. For example, if a child is using blocks to build, you might say to them, I see how you used 2 extra blocks to make the tower taller. Now it's a very tall tower, instead of just going over and saying, hey, nice tower, nice job. The previous example really helps the child frame their experience and their learning. And of course, making sure that all teachers are giving positive feedback that acknowledges student achievement and efforts for all students. So one thing to note with all of these practices is that they're used with all children, not just the typically developing children. So as you go back to your classroom and ask yourself these questions, think about how you're doing these things with your students with and without disabilities. And you want to look for discrepancies in that. So that brings us to our final practice, which is collaboration and communication. And this is another one that matters for all ages and all children and is part of just a good general ed program. But it's even more critical in an inclusive early childhood setting. And the reason is that young children develop and grow so rapidly, and they generally have many caregivers because they're not left alone, right? So they have parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents and aftercare staff and babysitters, and then all the school staff that work with the child. So in the case of of a young child with a disability, everyone needs to be on board and informed of changes to that child's IEP, to that child's schedule, or other major life events. It's also important for all of those caregivers to have opportunities to give feedback and share what is and isn't working with the student. So in practical terms, high quality collaboration means that all the adults on the IEP team communicate regularly and are attending all the IEP meetings. It means that all the adults have access to and have read the child's IEP. It means that parents and teachers have many methods of communicating and have frequent and ongoing bi-directional communication. So it's not just information coming from the teacher to the parent, but the parent is responding and it's a reciprocal conversation. And then high quality inclusion really can only come when the team has a common understanding and a shared goal. So we look for a written inclusion policy that all staff and families have read or have access to read when we look for inclusive classrooms in terms of collaboration and communication. So questions to ask yourself: have I read the IEPs? Do I know what they say? Do I regularly discuss students with other IEP team members? How am I communicating with my parents? And then, what's my school's inclusion policy? Do they have one? So now that we've looked at all the individual classroom practices from a high level, I want to take another view. You've probably noticed that a lot of what I've shared is about having a strong core early childhood program. So this is very much in line with what we know about response to intervention, which you can apply to inclusive practices. You've got to have a good, strong core program that's implemented well before you can start layering these more intricate strategies on top. So first off, a strong early childhood curriculum and a strong core program. And then, in no particular order, these are some of the other factors that go into an inclusive school. Prepared teachers, right? Teachers need to know child development and have training on the practices that I just shared. Having a solid foundation in early child development is critical. The teachers who are most successful in inclusive classrooms understand where their students are and where they need to go next. Staff also need to understand IEPs and the impact the child's disability has on their participation in the classroom. You also need a committed administration, and by committed, I mean one willing and able to allocate materials and staff time. You need buy-in from staff and families. Families need to understand the goal of inclusion generally and also know that their child is getting what he or she needs in the classroom. Of course, staff needs ongoing support in the form of PD materials, time, and then finally, a written policy or value statement that can be shared with your school community. So what's next? For teachers, you can take these questions about key practices back to your classroom and do a little self-assessment to identify areas where you might need some support. For administrators, you can use these questions to begin assessing where your teachers are and how ready your school is to develop your capacity for inclusion. We can also come out and observe some of your classrooms using the Inclusive Classroom Profile tool and give you feedback to help you design a plan. For some free or inexpensive professional development options, we have a Include course starting in the fall that's accepting applications. We also have a free conference for teachers on August 17th that has topics all about early childhood inclusion, some kind of back to school preparation. And then I would also suggest taking a look at the Department of Ed policy statement It's a few pages long, but inside that policy statement there are a lot of links to research and other resources that have been or are being developed by the states, including classroom checklists and just links to policy statements that on inclusion and tools to share with families. So it's worth taking a look at. So that's the end of our webinar. If there are any questions, you should feel free to type them into your text box and I'll take a minute to answer. And if there aren't any questions, then thank you so very much for joining us today. We're going to be, we've recorded the session and we will be posting the link to this recording on our website and in our next newsletter so that you can review or share it with your staff.